The point was that the Cadaver dog marked there, and also Keela, the blood sniffing dog, human blood sniffing dog, and they found blood underneath the tile.
When the case of Madeleine McCann, a 3-year-old girl who vanished from the Praia da Luz resort in Portugal in May 2007, reached a standstill, a dramatic turning point occurred that July. 2 cadaver dogs, Eddie and Keela, were brought into the investigation, introducing an entirely new direction that challenged the prevailing abduction theory dominating both the media and public perception. Eddie, trained to detect the scent of human remains, and Keela, specialized in detecting human blood, marked an unprecedented shift in the case, raising the possibility that Madeleine may have died in apartment 5A. Their involvement not only represented the first time cadaver dogs were used in this investigation, but also sent shockwaves through the true crime community, where the phrase, "Dogs don't lie, people do," became a symbol of growing suspicion and outrage at efforts to dismiss the dog's alerts. However, Kate and Jerry McCann, along with some investigators, hastily dismissed the value of Eddie and Keela. A grave mistake that left the public wondering if they were innocent. Why not pursue the leads offered by animals that cannot lie? Are Eddie and Keela pointing to the truth about Madeleine's fate? Or are it part of a tragic misunderstanding? And why did the McCanns, instead of cooperating, choose to reject the findings of dogs that cannot lie? These questions lead us into a deeper investigation, where the truth still hides in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered.
The point was that the Cadaver dog marked there, and also Keela, the blood sniffing dog, human blood sniffing dog, and they found blood underneath the tile. And it's very curious that you have a family of doctors, and there were only 2 toothbrushes, and there were 3 children. And for me, that's kind of obvious. They used Maddie's toothbrush to clean between the grut with bleach, right? And blood was found under the tiles with 15 out of 19 markers, which in some countries is enough for a conviction. But yeah, so there's no doubt that the forensics tell us that there was an accident behind that sofa.
In the Madeleine McCann case, 2 specially trained sniffer dogs, Eddie and Keela, took center stage, becoming key figures in this highly controversial investigation. Eddie was specifically trained to detect the scent of human cadavers, also known as cadaver scent. With exceptional capability, Eddie could detect the scent of a corpse just 1 to 2 hours after death. Notably, Eddie did not react to common odors such as garbage, food, or animal scents. It was able to detect even the faintest traces of cadaver scent, including those that had been thoroughly cleaned or concealed over time. Keela, Eddie's canine partner, was trained to detect human blood with extreme sensitivity, capable of identifying even microscopic traces of blood, even after attempts to clean or conceal them. Both dogs were trained by Martin Grime, a renowned expert in cadaver and crime scene detection dogs, who had been involved in over 200 major investigations and was highly respected in his field. During the investigation of Madeleine McCann's disappearance, Eddie and Keela generated a total of 17 alerts, each with significant implications that neither law enforcement nor the public could ignore. In apartment 5A, where the McCann family had stayed, the dogs made a total of 8 alerts. Behind the living room sofa, Eddie detected the scent of a cadaver, while Keela identified traces of human blood. This spot, located near the window in a narrow area, raised suspicions of a possible accident, such as a fall or violent impact. Additionally, Eddie alerted to the scent of a cadaver inside the wardrobe of the apartment. What made this finding even more suspicious was that no deaths had ever been reported in this location before, and only the McCann family had access to it. 5 additional alerts were recorded in the Renault Scenic car rented by the McCanns 24 days after Madeleine's disappearance. In the trunk of the vehicle, Eddie again detected cadaver scent, while Keela found traces of human blood. The discovery of cadaver scent in the trunk strongly fueled suspicions that the car may have been used to transport or conceal Madeleine's body, especially considering it was rented after her disappearance. 2 more alerts involved Cuddle Cat, Madeleine's beloved stuffed toy. Eddie indicated cadaver scent on the toy. Remarkably, his behavior during this discovery was unusual. Eddie sniffed, bit, and even tossed the toy into the air before finally marking it, and he only reacted decisively after the toy had been hidden. This led many to believe the toy had been in close contact with Madeleine's body for a certain period. The final 2 alerts were linked to clothing belonging to Kate McCann, Madeleine's mother. Eddie detected cadaver scent on one of her shirts, while no alerts were triggered by the clothing of any other individuals. This finding raised additional suspicions that Kate might have come into direct contact with the body. Beyond the alerts themselves, video footage showing Eddie and Keela at work caused a major public stir. In the videos, Eddie is seen barking aggressively and alerting at both the sofa and the car trunk, while Keela stands still, signaling the presence of blood at the sofa. These videos quickly circulated on YouTube and were viewed as compelling visual evidence, leading the public to place great faith in the dog's capabilities. From a scientific perspective, DNA samples collected from the trunk of the Renault Scenic showed that 15 out of 19 genetic markers matched Madeleine's DNA. However, experts cautioned that the results were too complex to draw definitive conclusions, as the samples may have been contaminated. Although not strong enough for legal prosecution, the DNA findings added another layer of suspicion surrounding the McCann family. Nevertheless, doubts about the dog's behavior persisted. The official report noted that Eddie had passed by the sofa and Cuddle Cat several times, without immediately alerting, only reacting after these items were hidden. In particular, Eddie's biting and tossing of Cuddle Cat before marking it was viewed as highly unusual. Some experts suggested that this behavior may have been influenced by the handler, specifically Martin Grime. Analysts also drew parallels to the TV show, America's Top Dog, where trained dogs sometimes gave false responses due to pressure or unintentional cues from their handlers. Scientific studies have shown that detection dogs can be significantly influenced by handler expectations or accidental signaling. Despite the ongoing controversy, the 17 alerts made by Eddie and Keela in the Madeleine McCann case remain one of the most striking and debated pieces of evidence in the history of missing persons investigations. The behavior of Eddie and Keela, the 2 cadaver and blood detection dogs involved in the Madeleine McCann case, has sparked significant controversy and raised serious questions about the reliability of their findings. Eddie, in particular, exhibited unusual actions during several searches. In some instances, he passed by key locations such as the sofa and Cuddle Cat multiple times without immediately marking them. Remarkably, he only reacted after certain objects, like Cuddle Cat, were moved or hidden. One specific scene showed Eddie sniffing, biting, and tossing the toy into the air before finally signaling. These actions were flagged in official reports by Portuguese police and forensic experts, who requested further clarification. Some sections of the report suggested that Eddie's delayed reactions and a typical marking behavior might indicate that his responses were influenced, whether consciously or unconsciously, by his handler. This leads to broader concerns about the role of Martin Grime, the dog's trainer, and the person in full control of their search sessions. Grime's reputation as an expert in canine scent detection is well known, with over 200 successful cases under his belt. However, experts have raised red flags about how unconscious expectations or emotional tension from a handler can affect a dog's behavior during searches. Scientific literature on animal behavior has long discussed this phenomenon, suggesting that dogs, despite their training, are sensitive to subtle cues from their handlers. If a handler is overly focused or has heightened expectations during a search, the dog may begin to mark in response to the handler's cues rather than following its natural instincts. In high-stakes cases, this effect can intensify, potentially leading to inaccurate results. Supporting this concern, a scientific study cited in the investigation revealed that a handler's attitude, emotional state, and physical behavior can profoundly impact a dog's performance, sometimes causing false positives or inconsistent reactions. This was further demonstrated in the widely viewed television program, America's Top Dog, where even highly trained police dogs occasionally failed or reacted erratically when their handlers exhibited nervousness or stress. The show highlighted how canine behavior can be significantly altered by a handler's body language, voice tone, or stress level, especially in high-pressure situations. In the context of the Madeleine McCann case, where media scrutiny was intense and the stakes were unprecedentedly high, it is plausible that Martin Grime, like any handler under extreme pressure, could have inadvertently influenced the dog's responses. Beyond the handler's personal influence, several additional factors contributed to the skepticism surrounding the dog's behavior. The global prominence and relentless media coverage of the case created an unparalleled level of pressure on everyone involved, including Grime. Such stress could easily erode objectivity, potentially causing subconscious cues or unintentional signaling during the searches. Furthermore, some video footage raised eyebrows as viewers observed subtle movements, vocal inflections, or gestures from the handler that may have directed the dogs. Critics have speculated that Grime may have either inadvertently or deliberately signaled the dogs during the investigation. The most glaring issue remains the repeated behavior of Eddie passing over specific locations several times before finally marking them. Unlike in many other investigations, where detection dogs typically respond immediately upon sensing their target's scent, Eddie's delayed markings appeared unnatural. This led to growing suspicion that Eddie was not responding autonomously, but rather reacting to some form of expectation or pressure from the handler. Such delayed responses are highly atypical in trained detection dogs, making them a focal point for critics who question the legitimacy of the results. There remains, however, a clear divide in public opinion regarding the role of the handler's influence in this case. Supporters of Eddie and Keela argue that the dog's performance cannot simply be dismissed. They emphasize that the dogs gave a total of 17 alerts at specific, highly relevant locations directly tied to the McCanns, locations where no previous cadaver scent had ever been recorded. Additionally, they point out Martin Grime's proven track record, arguing that his expertise and history of success lend credibility to the results. These supporters maintain that the combination of the dogs' specialized training, the specificity of their alerts, and the absence of cadaver presence in the past makes it unlikely that the alerts were merely the product of handler bias. On the other hand, a growing number of forensic experts and members of the true crime community argue that the case is a textbook example of unconscious handler influence. They assert that the dog's irregular behavior during the searches, especially the delayed reactions and peculiar interactions with items like Cuddle Cat, strongly suggests that the dogs may have been guided, knowingly or not, by their handler's expectations. For these skeptics, the unusual circumstances of the alerts, coupled with video evidence of potentially suggestive behavior by the handler, raise serious doubts about the dog's reliability in this case. In their view, the possibility of false positives caused by unconscious cues is too significant to ignore, especially in a case as complex and emotionally charged as that of Madeleine McCann. Ultimately, the debate over Eddie and Keela's behavior remains unresolved, underscoring the need for greater scrutiny and objectivity when evaluating canine evidence in criminal investigations. In cases where traditional evidence is lacking or compromised, forensic scent detection has emerged as a powerful yet controversial tool, especially in the form of cadaver dogs. These highly trained canines are not merely reacting to surface smells or generalized cues. They are detecting the presence of specific chemical compounds emitted by decomposing human remains, namely VOL or VOCs. When a human body begins to decompose, it releases a complex array of VOCs into the surrounding environment. These compounds are the result of autolysis and bacterial activity, including molecules such as putrescine, cadaverin, and dimethyl disulfide. What makes trained cadaver dogs like Eddie uniquely effective is their ability to detect minute traces of these VOCs, even when the body itself is no longer present. Studies show that these scent molecules can bind to porous materials, including textiles, upholstery, and plastics, and persist long after the source has been removed. This science is particularly relevant in the McCann case. Eddie alerted to multiple items: the back of a couch, a wardrobe, the trunk of a Renault Scenic, and Cuddle Cat, Madeleine's stuffed toy. Critics have questioned how such scents could remain, especially in the absence of a body. However, research from cadaver detection studies across the United States and Europe confirms that VOCs can remain detectable for weeks, even months, depending on environmental conditions and cleaning practices. In controlled laboratory experiments, cadaver dogs have successfully detected scent traces on clothing that had been stored for over 60 days after brief exposure to human remains. Environmental factors, such as temperature and ventilation, can influence the strength of these scents, but do not eliminate them. In fact, sealed or low airflow environments, such as the interior of a car or the confined space of a wardrobe, may preserve VOCs more effectively. This explains how Eddie could alert to the trunk of a car rented 24 days after Madeleine's disappearance. Unless the dog was grossly mislulled or manipulated, a claim never supported by objective evidence, the only logical explanation for such an alert is the previous presence of decompositional compounds. Complementing Eddie's role is Keela, the blood detection dog. Unlike cadaver dogs, Keela is trained to detect human blood, even when cleaned or diluted beyond visual recognition. Blood leaves behind biological markers, heme, iron, and amino acids, that, while invisible to the human eye, remain chemically active. Crime scene reconstruction experts have documented cases where blood residue invisible to luminol, or UV light, was nonetheless located by dogs like Keela, leading to critical breakthroughs. In the McCann investigation, Keela's alert to the same areas as Eddie, most notably behind the sofa and inside the trunk, adds corroborative weight to the theory that a decomposing body and bleeding may have coexisted in these locations. Scientific analysis of trace blood has shown that even a pinprick of dried blood can remain detectable after extensive washing, especially on fabrics or car upholstery. Dogs trained to detect these substances do not rely on visible stains. They respond to scent signatures embedded in the material at a molecular level. Skeptics may argue that cadaver dog alerts are not foolproof, and they would be correct in asserting that scent detection should not serve as the sole basis for conviction. But forensic science never claims infallibility. The strength of scent detection lies in its consistency, specificity, and contextual placement. Eddie and Keela alerted at 17 discrete locations, most of them connected directly to the McCann's personal environment. None of these alerts occurred randomly or in unrelated areas. Internationally, courts vary in their treatment of cadaver dog evidence. In the United States, several jurisdictions consider dog alerts probable cause for further investigation or warrant acquisition. In the United Kingdom, alerts are admissible if supported by other evidence. In Portugal, where the McCann investigation took place, the judiciary tends to be more skeptical, but does not exclude such evidence outright, particularly when reinforced by other findings, such as DNA partial matches or timeline inconsistencies. What strengthens the evidentiary value in this case is the presence of multiple overlapping indicators, canine alerts, a partial DNA match to Madeleine in the trunk, unusual behavior patterns, and absence of external evidence of abduction. In forensic analysis, this convergence is referred to as multi-source corroboration. No single piece may confirm guilt, but when independent indicators align, they collectively raise the evidentiary weight beyond coincidence. Additional case studies further support the reliability of cadaver dogs. In the Casey Anthony trial, a UST, a cadaver dog's alert to the trunk of the accused's vehicle played a key role in the prosecution's theory, even though no body was ever found in that location. In the case of Christine Jessup in Canada, a cadaver dog located remains in an area previously searched by human teams. Numerous missing persons investigations globally have been reopened or redirected after dog alerts, revealed burial, or containment sites previously dismissed. Critics sometimes point to the rare instances of false alerts, such as in the Zapata case, which Jerry McCann himself cited in defense. However, as clarified by investigators, that case ultimately confirmed the dog's accuracy once all evidence was revealed. Citing such cases, without full context, misrepresents the scientific foundation and investigative application of scent detection. The McCann case, viewed through the prism of forensic science, reveals a scenario where the dogs did not act erratically or inconsistently. Instead, they demonstrated targeted, repetitive, and localized alerts, all concentrated on objects and locations under the McCann's direct control. No alerts occurred in areas occupied by strangers or hotel staff. No other apartment was flagged, no shared public space. Only the apartment, vehicle, clothing, and possessions of the family themselves. This forensic foundation does not convict, but it builds a compelling platform from which further inquiry becomes not only justified, but necessary. For investigators, dog alerts are often the starting point, not the conclusion. And in this case, the trail they followed has yet to be fully explained, much less refuted. In any investigation involving the unexplained disappearance of a child, the timeline of the parents' behavior in the immediate aftermath becomes a vital reference point. Not because parents are presumed guilty by default, but because genuine grief is hard to fabricate, and inconsistencies are easier to detect when emotions are raw. In the case of Kate and Jerry McCann, the first 30 days following Madeleine's disappearance present a timeline that is not only meticulously documented, but also riddled with strategic decisions, calculated appearances, and choices that point more toward image management than the unfiltered agony of loss. Let us begin on May 3, 2007, the night Madeleine was reported missing from apartment 5A at the Ocean Club Resort in Praia da Luz, Portugal. The timeline shows that within minutes, the McCanns and their friends initiated a search, not for evidence, but for explanations. Crucially, they contacted not just local authorities, but also media representatives and the British consulate. This is not unusual in itself. But what stands out is the early and deliberate involvement of media handlers, which would grow in importance in the days that followed. By May 4, just one day after Madeleine's disappearance, Kate and Jerry had already begun crafting a public narrative. In interviews, they described an abduction scenario, despite the lack of any signs of forced entry, no fingerprints on the window shutters, and no eyewitness accounts of a break-in. Rather than expressing uncertainty or a plea for information, their statements projected conviction. It was not, "We don't know what happened." It was, "She was taken." This early certainty would come to define the McCann media strategy: confident, controlled, and emotionally restrained. Within 5 days, the couple made a decision that would alter the course of public perception. They hired public relations consultants to manage their message. By mid-May, the McCanns had entered into contracts with Justine McGuinness, a political PR figure with no background in child recovery or criminal communication. The objective, it seemed, was not to assist in finding Madeleine, but to manage optics. What is more striking is that within 3 weeks, they engaged the services of Carter, Ruck, one of the UK's most aggressive libel law firms. Known for representing politicians, oligarchs, and celebrities, Carter, Ruck specializes not in uncovering truth, but in shutting down criticism. For a grieving family, the choice of such a firm so early, and with no public accusations of guilt against them, was an anomaly. It raised critical questions. Why was so much energy being placed on controlling the narrative, silencing skeptics, and preemptively managing press coverage, rather than on cooperating fully with investigators? In parallel, inconsistencies began to emerge between the McCanns' public statements and their private actions. In one early interview, Jerry stated, "We will leave no stone unturned." Yet police records indicate that the McCanns were reluctant to submit themselves to re-interviews, declined lie detector tests, and resisted key requests by Portuguese investigators, including the reconstruction of the night of May 3rd. Another contradiction lies in their description of their movements. Publicly, The McCanns stated that they remained close to the investigation in Praia da Luz to aid the police. Privately, however, records show they made several trips, both within Portugal and abroad, beginning just days after the disappearance. One of the earliest involved travel to Fatima, a Catholic pilgrimage site. While this may seem spiritually motivated, critics argue it aligned more with public sympathy optics than investigative necessity. More alarming was their eventual return to the UK on September 9, 2007, shortly after being declared arguidos, formal suspects, by Portuguese authorities. Their departure was framed as a necessity for emotional recovery, but the timing, immediately after the status change, raised questions of flight from legal vulnerability. That they left Portugal without facing further questioning only cemented suspicions among both local investigators and the international public. Even small behavioral cues became subjects of debate. Footage shows Kate McCann repeatedly avoiding direct eye contact in interviews, clutching Cuddle Cat in early appearances, then later washing the toy after it was flagged by cadaver dogs. In the language of behavioral forensics, such shifts are not random. They reflect calculated disengagement from emotionally dangerous material. Jerry, conversely, often adopted a more clinical tone in interviews, referring to Madeleine's disappearance in passive, procedural language. Their emotional flatness, particularly in moments where spontaneous anguish might be expected, contributed to the growing sense that this was less a parental tragedy and more a public relations campaign. One particularly telling inconsistency arose during media questioning. When asked about the lack of DNA or physical evidence of an abduction, Jerry responded dismissively. Whoever took her was very clean. Yet, this offhand remark belies logic. A clean abduction with no noise, no fingerprints, no hair, no signs of struggle, and no reliable sighting of a stranger exiting the complex, defies not only forensic likelihood, but also common sense. Meanwhile, the McCanns launched the Find Madeleine Fund, which was publicly positioned as a non-profit initiative. However, later scrutiny revealed that the fund was a private limited company, not a registered charity, allowing the family greater control over disbursement and legal strategy. This financial decision, again made within the first month, underscored a pattern's early legal structuring, media filtering, and strategic control, rather than investigative transparency. In sum, the first 30 days of the McCanns' behavior reflect a convergence of PR maneuvering, legal fortification, and emotional restraint. Forensic psychologists describe this as pre-emptive innocence projection, a behavior pattern where individuals, fearing accusation, construct a narrative of blamelessness so thoroughly and so early that it undermines their credibility. Genuine grief is disorganized, raw, and unpredictable. What we observe here is not grief. It is a strategy. By overlaying this behavioral timeline with forensic findings, such as the 17 canine alerts, the scent molecules on Cuddle Cat, the partial DNA match in the rental car trunk, we gain not just a physical map of the case, but a psychological roadmap. The McCanns' every move in those early weeks appears designed not for clarity, but for control. Not for cooperation, but for containment. And as the days passed, what they said and what they did increasingly became two very different stories. In the intricate web of events surrounding the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, several behaviors displayed by her parents, Kate and Jerry McCann, have drawn scrutiny from investigators, forensic experts, and the broader true crime community. These behaviors, often subtle yet symbolically potent, have become central to debates about potential concealment, uncooperative conduct, or simply psychological responses to extreme trauma. Each action must be examined in context, not with presumption of guilt, but through the lens of logic, behavioral analysis, and evidentiary consistency. One of the earliest behaviors that raised eyebrows was Kate McCann's decision to wash Madeleine's beloved toy, Cuddle Cat. The timing was striking. This occurred shortly after the cadaver dog Eddie alerted to the toy, indicating the scent of human decomposition. Cuddle Cat was not just a toy, it had become a highly personal, emotional symbol. Kate was seen clutching it constantly in interviews and public appearances, using it almost like a surrogate for her daughter's presence. To then clean such an emotionally significant item so soon after a scent detection puzzled many. In the investigative context, this action was interpreted not as an act of hygiene or coping, but potentially as an attempt to remove evidence. Critics argued that a parent desperate to retain the memory of their missing child would not so readily sanitize the one object that embodied that connection, especially one that had just been flagged by a trained cadaver dog. While there is no law prohibiting such a gesture, and grief manifests differently for each individual, the choice to wash Cuddle Cat remains one of the most discussed and symbolically charged decisions in the case. Jerry McCann, too, exhibited behaviors that sparked concern, particularly in how he addressed evidence from the cadaver dogs. At one point, Jerry cited the Zapata case as an example of canine error, attempting to dismiss the reliability of scent detection. However, this statement was factually flawed. In the Zapata case, the suspect later confessed, and the dog's detection was validated. This misrepresentation led some observers to believe Jerry was intentionally undermining the credibility of the dogs, not by attacking their training or methodology, but by invoking a false precedent. In forensic psychology, efforts to discredit evidence without factual basis are often viewed as red flags, especially when coming from individuals under scrutiny. Whether this was a genuine mistake or a calculated deflection remains open to interpretation, but the consequences were clear. It seeded doubt, not in the dogs, but in Jerry's own credibility. Another moment that stirred significant criticism was Jerry's infamous remark, "Why don't you just ask the dogs?" The quote, delivered when questioned about the dog's alerts, struck many as flippant and dismissive. In a case saturated with emotional tension, where every word from the parents was under public and legal scrutiny, such a sarcastic response seemed dissonant. For those already suspicious, the statement came across as a defensive mechanism, one that diminished the seriousness of the investigation. More broadly, it reflected a posture of irritation or resistance when faced with uncomfortable lines of inquiry. While sarcasm under stress is not inherently indicative of guilt, it added to a pattern of responses that fueled public skepticism and investigative concern. Perhaps the most glaring act of non-cooperation occurred during Kate McCann's formal interview with Portuguese police, where she refused to answer 48 specific questions. These questions were not peripheral. They focused on the night Madeleine disappeared, the layout of the apartment, and the interactions between the parents and their friends. Legally, Kate had every right to remain silent. However, in the psychological landscape of an investigation, silence can be interpreted in multiple ways. Investigators often look for transparency and engagement, especially from those closest to a victim. By declining to engage with these crucial questions, Kate inadvertently projected an image of avoidance. Some investigators viewed this as a defensive wall, possibly indicative of deeper knowledge about the events in question. Again, this cannot be used to assign guilt, but it undeniably affected perceptions and momentum within the case. A separate, but equally curious detail arose from reports by neighbors and residents at the Ocean Club Resort. Multiple witnesses observed that the Renault Scenic, the car rented by the McCanns 24 days after Madeleine's disappearance, had its trunk left open almost every night. This peculiar pattern drew attention because both Eddie and Keela had alerted to the trunk, detecting scents of cadaver and blood respectively. In forensic analysis, an open trunk could signify an attempt to air out or dissipate lingering odors, particularly those associated with decomposition. No official explanation from the family convincingly accounted for this behavior. Combined with the dog's alerts and the DNA profile, of 15 out of 19 markers matching Madeleine, this detail compounded suspicions about the vehicle's use and its potential role in post-incident concealment. Although the evidence was circumstantial, the consistency of the observations made it difficult to ignore. Finally, police reports indicated that certain pieces of furniture within apartment 5A appeared to have been moved between the time of Madeleine's disappearance and the dog searches. Most notably, the sofa, one of the main areas where Eddie detected cadaver scent, had signs of displacement. Investigators noted subtle discrepancies in the room's layout, suggesting someone may have rearranged or sanitized the space. In forensic terms, alterations to a potential crime scene after the fact are seen as highly suspicious. While such changes could result from innocent cleaning or general anxiety, they also carry the implication of scene manipulation. The dog's focused alert on the area only heightened these concerns. This was not merely about objects being out of place. It was about the timing, the context, and the proximity to the central focus of the investigation. Taken individually, these behaviors could be interpreted in a variety of ways, some benign, others more sinister. Yet when evaluated collectively, they form a pattern of actions that deviate from expected norms in cases involving missing children. From the emotional symbolism of cleaning a toy to misrepresenting prior case law, from silence during questioning to unexplained behaviors around a rental car, each choice adds a layer of complexity to the portrait of the investigation. While no single act provides definitive proof of wrongdoing, their cumulative effect has undeniably shaped public perception and investigative direction. In cases where direct evidence is lacking, behavioral analysis becomes a critical tool. And in this case, it leaves far more questions than answers. In the realm of criminal investigations, behavior is evidence. When tangible proof is absent or inconclusive, the actions and psychological responses of those closest to the victim become a critical layer of analysis. In the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, the behavior of her parents, Kate and Jerry McCann, has consistently drawn attention not just from law enforcement, but from psychologists, forensic analysts, and the broader true crime community. These behaviors, when examined through a forensic psychological lens, exhibit clear markers of defensive posturing, concealment strategy, and psychological dissonance. Far from typical expressions of unfiltered grief or frantic desperation, their responses appear calculated, sanitized, and in several instances, counterintuitive, provoking serious doubt about their role in the events that unfolded. To begin, one must understand the concept of defensive behavior in the context of forensic psychology. Defensiveness is not merely an emotional reaction. It is often a behavioral indicator of internal conflict, especially when individuals are attempting to maintain a public image inconsistent with their private knowledge. In this case, Kate McCann's refusal to answer 48 critical questions during a police interrogation is not simply a legal decision. It reveals a strategic silence, a conscious decision to avoid engagement with potentially self-incriminating material. Such behavior raises immediate red flags in investigative psychology. An innocent parent, desperate for answers, rarely declines to participate in the very process that could help uncover the truth. Silence, in this context, is not protection. It is avoidance. This avoidance becomes even more troubling when contextualized with other decisions that reflect what psychologists refer to as covering tracks. This behavioral pattern involves preemptive actions taken to erase, obscure, or modify elements of a crime or incident that might point toward culpability. In the McCann case, several examples stand out. Most notably, the decision to wash Cuddle Cat, a personal and emotionally symbolic toy belonging to Madeleine, immediately after a cadaver dog had alerted to it. This is a profound deviation from expected behavior. Cuddle Cat was not an ordinary object. Kate had previously been seen clutching it in interviews, a visible connection to her missing daughter. To clean such an emotionally saturated item so soon after it was flagged by a trained cadaver dog suggests a deeper, more calculated motive than grief. It indicates an effort to sanitize, both emotionally and potentially forensically, something that had become dangerously symbolic. In forensic terms, this is more than ill-judged. It is interpreted as evidence of intent to destroy or alter trace evidence. Another action that aligns with this behavioral profile is the repeated opening of the trunk of the Renault Scenic rental car, another area where cadaver and blood detection dogs marked alerts. Witnesses reported that the trunk was often left open at night. This, on the surface, seems harmless. But when paired with the fact that the car was rented after Madeleine's disappearance, and that DNA evidence matching Madeleine was found there, the behavior shifts in interpretation. Forensic analysts theorize that leaving the trunk open may have been an attempt to disperse or minimize the scent of decomposition. In behavioral profiling, actions that have no reasonable explanation but correlate with evidence tampering are rarely dismissed as coincidence. These examples converge on a critical psychological framework over control. This refers to the tendency of individuals, under extreme psychological pressure, to compensate for inner chaos by exerting excessive control over their external environment. Over-controllers are not necessarily aggressive or overt in their actions. Instead, they manipulate their surroundings subtly, through cleaning, reorganizing, or recontextualizing physical spaces. The rearrangement of furniture within apartment 5A, after the initial police examination, fits this mold precisely. Notably, the area near the sofa, where the cadaver dog had alerted, appeared to have been disturbed, suggesting a conscious attempt to shift the narrative of what occurred in that space. In criminal psychology, such behavior is rarely innocent. The act of altering a potential crime scene is inherently suspicious and typically driven by the knowledge, or fear, that incriminating evidence remains. These behavioral inconsistencies are further magnified when we analyze verbal cues. Jerry McCann's sarcastic quip, "Why don't you just ask the dogs?" when questioned about the cadaver alerts, is not the statement of a distraught father. It is the deflection of someone emotionally distancing themselves from the evidence. Sarcasm in high-stress situations is often a defense mechanism, used to control the narrative, assert dominance over the discussion, or trivialize critical findings. From a psychological perspective, this type of response is minimization, a classic technique used to downplay severity, suggest doubt, and dismiss relevance. Rather than confronting the deeply unsettling implications of the dog's alerts, Jerry's remark reframes the evidence as absurd, even laughable. This not only undermines the seriousness of the investigation, but signals a defensive posture, one that is at odds with an innocent person's desperate search for the truth. Layered beneath these behaviors is a deeper psychological tension best understood through the concept of cognitive dissonance. This occurs when a person holds conflicting beliefs or behaviors, such as knowing one's involvement in a crime while simultaneously maintaining a public persona of innocence. The mental strain of this contradiction often leaks out through inconsistent actions, rigid emotional control, or erratic decisions. In the McCann case, the public image projected, composed, media, savvy, and strategically managed, clashes with the unexplained behaviors cataloged during the investigation. The result is a fractured psychological profile, marked not by the rawness of trauma, but by the controlled choreography of concealment. An especially potent indicator of this tension is found in the comparative behavioral models of parents who have genuinely lost children in unsolved disappearances. Such individuals typically display spontaneous emotion, demand exhaustive investigations, and cling to any item that may represent a connection to their child. They do not sanitize personal items, they preserve them. They do not challenge detection dogs, they encourage every lead. They do not refuse questioning, they demand answers. The McCanns, however, have exhibited a reversed behavioral spectrum, one that aligns less with trauma and more with strategy. To be clear, psychological profiling is not evidence of guilt. It is a tool, one that aids investigators in understanding behavior, establishing patterns, and identifying deviations from statistical norms. But when multiple behaviors point in the same direction, defensive silence, calculated sarcasm, environmental manipulation, and symbolic erasure, the conclusion becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. These are not isolated quirks of grief. They are actions steeped in intention, awareness, and a desire to control not only what is known, but what might one day be discovered. Perhaps the most unsettling realization is that none of these behaviors require proof of guilt to be concerning. In the absence of a body, a confession, or conclusive forensic data, behavior is the evidence. And in the McCann case, the behavior documented, across time, context and circumstance, reveals a pattern consistent with concealment, not transparency, with evasion, not cooperation. In conclusion, when viewed through the uncompromising lens of forensic psychology, the McCann's actions paint a troubling picture. From erasing possible scent traces, to avoiding direct questioning, to manipulating emotional narrative, their behavior aligns far more closely with profiles of individuals involved in concealment than with innocent victims of tragedy. The defensive, evasive, and over-controlled nature of their responses speaks volumes. Not through what they said, but through what they did. In the silent language of psychology, their actions echo louder than words. If the alerts from Eddie and Keela were accurate, then Christian Brueckner cannot be the perpetrator. These dogs, trained by one of the most experienced handlers in the UK, do not guess, speculate, or rely on theory. They respond only to specific biological realities, traces of human decomposition and the scent of blood. And in this case, they did so multiple times, across different locations, all of which were closely associated with the McCanns. From the living area in apartment 5EA, to Kate McCann's clothes, to Madeleine's toy, to the trunk of the rental car. Every single alert formed a forensic trail that pointed in one direction. Not one of those signals led investigators to Christian Brueckner. He was never known to have entered the apartment. He had no known contact with any of the items or locations that triggered the alerts. He did not use the vehicle, and no scent, no trace, no indication of his presence, biological or otherwise, was ever linked to the places where the dogs reacted. That leads us to a simple but unavoidable conclusion: if Madeleine died in the apartment, as the alerts strongly suggest, then Brueckner could not have been the one responsible. He wasn't there. He didn't touch what was touched. He didn't move what was moved. And he left behind nothing for two highly trained dogs to detect. This isn't just absence of evidence. It is a kind of forensic exclusion. The dogs didn't miss him. They ignored him, because nothing about him was ever present at the physical level they were trained to detect. In real-world investigations, cadaver dog evidence doesn't work in isolation, but it also doesn't lie. Their alert means something happened where they signal. Their silence means someone did not leave behind what they're trained to find. So if we take their role seriously, then we cannot continue to entertain a theory that directly contradicts the very core of what the dogs revealed. It's not just inconsistent, it's illogical. Any argument that still places Brueckner at the center of the crime must either reject the dog's reliability or invent a scenario in which he somehow orchestrated a death in a space he never entered, using objects he never touched, without leaving behind any physical trace, then left the rest to be mishandled or misunderstood by police. That is not a theory, it is a stretch of imagination, and it places the burden of proof on thin air rather than on observable fact. The moment we accept the dogs as accurate, the structure of suspicion must shift. To do otherwise is to cling to a suspect simply because he fits a certain image of danger, of criminal history, of proximity. But even proximity is a fragile thing. Praia da Luz was filled with tourists, workers, locals, and transients. Being near is not being involved. And having a disturbing past does not mean being guilty in a case with no link to your presence. This is not to say Brueckner is innocent in the moral sense. He may very well be guilty of other crimes, some of which are far worse than the public knows. But guilt in this case must rest on what can be proven. And the evidence the dogs presented does not just fail to implicate him. It actively pushes him out of the frame. The dogs drew a map. Brueckner isn't on it. And the longer we ignore that map, the more we risk building a case on bias instead of fact. So where does that leave us? At a crossroads. If we trust Eddie and Keela, we must let their silence toward Brueckner speak. Because it is not just the presence of clues that guides good investigations. It's knowing what isn't there and accepting what that absence means. In this case, it means the man we've been told to fear may not be the one we should be watching. If the alerts from Eddie and Keela were wrong, then all attention naturally shifts to Christian Brueckner. without the dog's alerts pointing investigators inward. Toward the apartment, the family's belongings, the McCanns themselves, the narrative reverts to an external abduction, and Brueckner becomes the central suspect by default. But the key question must then be asked: without the dogs, does the case against Brueckner actually stand on its own? And the answer is far more fragile than many would expect. Most of what ties Brueckner to the Madeleine McCann case is circumstantial. He lived in the area. He had a criminal history, including crimes against children. He had a camper van. He received a suspicious phone call around the time Madeleine disappeared. And he made unsettling remarks about young girls. These facts form the backbone of suspicion. But suspicion is not conviction. Living near a crime scene does not mean being at the scene. Receiving a call does not prove what was said. Owning a van does not prove it was used in a kidnapping. And disturbing behavior in unrelated cases does not prove involvement in this one. Forensic evidence, the cornerstone of modern justice, is entirely missing. No DNA, no fingerprints, no hair fibers, no clothing. No trace of Madeleine was ever found in any property, vehicle, or digital device linked to Brueckner. Despite years of international investigation and millions spent, not a single forensic connection has been made between him and the child. That silence speaks volumes. Even the phone data, once touted as a breakthrough, shows nothing beyond proximity. And proximity, especially in a tourist zone, proves nothing. As for the so-called confessions, they are vague and secondhand. One alleged statement about knowing what happened to Madeleine was recounted by a former acquaintance, years later, with no recording or corroboration. In legal terms, this is hearsay, not hard proof. The German prosecution has repeatedly expressed strong belief in Brueckner's guilt. But belief is not a substitute for evidence. The fact that charges still haven't been filed in the Madeleine case, despite him being named as a formal suspect since 2020, reflects this gap. What we see is a suspect who fits the role of a predator, but not the role of the perpetrator in this specific case. And there lies the danger: confusing a pattern with a person. It's easy to project guilt onto someone who seems capable of it. But justice requires more than a chilling profile. It requires a clear link to the crime. A man with a dark past, placed near a tragedy, but never inside it. And in any fair system, near is not enough. This isn't to say he should be dismissed entirely. His background deserves scrutiny. His movements should be investigated. But building a legal case on inference and instinct, without tangible evidence, is dangerous for both justice and truth. Because if Brueckner didn't do it, and we focus all efforts on him, then the real answers remain buried. The real culprit, if not him, is given more time, more distance, and more silence. That's the risk of leaning too hard on a suspect who fits the story but doesn't fit the scene. And in the absence of the dog's alerts, what we're left with is exactly that: a story, not a case. The Madeleine McCann case now stands at the heart of a paradox, one that no theory has resolved without leaving uncomfortable contradictions behind. If the dogs were right, then Madeleine died in apartment 5A, and the events that followed involved people within her immediate circle. That scenario completely removes Brueckner from suspicion, because the very evidence that points to death, blood, decomposition scent, specific locations, also isolates the crime scene to a space he never entered. But if the dogs were wrong, if we discard all 17 alerts as errors, then we are forced to rely solely on the case against Brueckner. And that case, when laid bare, lacks the foundation needed for prosecution. It becomes clear the two primary investigative directions, death in the apartment or external abduction, are mutually exclusive. And yet, neither path leads to resolution. The stronger the case for the dogs, the weaker the link to Brueckner. The stronger the suspicion toward Brueckner, the more we must discount what the dogs revealed. But here's the deeper problem. The public narrative wants both. It wants to believe the dogs were onto something, and that Brueckner is the monster responsible. That combination, however, doesn't hold up to scrutiny. One cancels the other. We cannot place Madeleine's death inside a controlled family space and also argue that a stranger with no access, no contact, and no trace is to blame. And yet, the investigation has tried to walk that line for years, balancing political pressure, media expectations, and the haunting need for closure. What's left is a kind of investigative limbo, where no direction feels safe, and every answer raises more questions. The McCanns, once suspects, are now protected by a presumption of innocence bolstered by public sympathy and legal support. Brueckner, while heavily scrutinized, remains untouched by formal charges in this case. And in the middle of it all lies a child, lost in a fog of conflicting narratives. This paradox paralyzes progress. Each time the case leans toward one conclusion, it risks invalidating the other. To resolve it, the investigation must do what it has long avoided: choose. Either the dogs were right, and the focus must return inward, or the dogs were wrong, and a real case against Brueckner must be built on solid, independent grounds. But pretending both paths can be true only deepens the confusion. The truth cannot be in two places at once. And until that is acknowledged, Madeleine's story will remain trapped, not just in mystery, but in contradiction. The case of Madeleine McCann has become more than a criminal investigation. It is a study in how truth can get buried beneath contradiction, how evidence can be sidelined, and how even the most advanced investigative tools can be dismissed when they don't fit a preferred narrative. If there's one thing this case leaves behind, it's not closure. It's caution. Cadaver dogs, like Eddie and Keela, are among the most powerful tools in modern forensic search. They do not rely on testimonies or theories. They react to biological reality, human decomposition, and the presence of blood, even long after a body is gone. Their work in this case provided one of the few direct, physical clues. But dogs are not evidence by themselves. Their alerts require confirmation through DNA testing, chemical analysis, and controlled verification. In Madeleine's case, the dogs gave clear and repeated signals, but the forensic follow-up fell short. The DNA results were inconclusive. The locations were not preserved properly. The cooperation between UK and Portuguese authorities was inconsistent. And so, a tool that should have opened new doors became a point of debate instead. We must also learn from the risks of misinterpretation. Dogs are influenced, intentionally or not, by their handlers. This is a known phenomenon, backed by studies in behavioral science, and seen even in professional dog trials like America's Top Dog. A dog might circle the same area, but alert only when the handler's posture shifts. That doesn't mean the dog is wrong. It means the method must be managed carefully. Proper double, blind setups, objective video analysis, and unbiased interpretation are essential. In this case, the dogs were filmed, but their results were too easily pushed aside as unreliable, without serious counter-evidence. That itself is a lesson dismissing precise alerts, simply because their inconvenience sets a dangerous precedent in criminal investigations. Much of the suspicion around Kate and Jerry McCann didn't begin with forensic science. It began with behavior. Kate washed Cuddle Cat, the toy her daughter reportedly held every day. She refused to answer 48 out of 49 questions during police interrogation. Jerry publicly mocked the idea that dogs could be useful, referencing failed cases instead of engaging with the evidence in his own. These actions might have explanations, but they also raise legitimate questions. When a child goes missing, parents are expected to grasp at every thread, to welcome every clue, no matter how small. The McCanns did the opposite when it came to the dogs, and that contradiction became fuel for public doubt. This is not about guilt or innocence. It's about understanding that, in cases involving close emotional ties, behavior matters. It shapes public perception. It influences investigators. It determines whether certain leads are pursued or ignored. When parents of a missing child dismiss potential evidence, the reaction is not neutral. It triggers a shift in how people interpret their role in the story. Whether intentional or not, the McCanns' actions contributed to the suspicion. That is a painful but necessary truth to acknowledge. Finally, there is the role of the public. Millions of people who have followed the Madeleine case for over a decade. Some analyze the evidence. Others follow the narrative. Many form strong opinions. The rise of forums, podcasts, documentaries, and comment sections has turned true crime into a cultural force. And with that power comes responsibility. Cases like this teach us that justice is not served by echo chambers. It is shaped by facts, nuance, and the willingness to hold discomfort without jumping to conclusion. In this case, some chose to believe the parents without question. Others convicted them in their minds from the start. Some treat Brueckner as the only possible villain, based on his past alone. But the truth, whatever it is, will not come from popularity, because the moment public opinion replaces due process, the real truth gets buried, just like the one we still search for in Praia da Luz. And so we arrive at a place no one wants to be, not at a resolution, but at a deadlock. If the dogs were right, then the crime did not involve Brueckner. If the dogs were wrong, then no hard evidence links anyone else. The suspects are named, but the evidence doesn't follow. The clues are there, but no one agrees what they mean. The investigators point in different directions. The media tells different stories. And the child at the center of it all has not come home. Maybe that's the most important lesson of all in the pursuit of truth. Consistency matters more than comfort. It's not enough to believe in someone's guilt or innocence. We must be willing to follow the same standard of proof for everyone, no matter who they are, how they behave, or how their story makes us feel. Until that happens, Madeleine's case will remain exactly where it is today. Not forgotten, but unresolved. Not closed, but quietly stalled. Somewhere between fact and fiction, belief and doubt, theory and truth. And in that space, the real story is still waiting.